فصل في الحث على طلب العلم والعمل والتعليم واطلب علوم الدين وارجع إلى اليقين فالعلم قوت القلب فيه رضاء الرب.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this opportunity to discuss this very important text by Professor Syed Muhiyuddin Al-Attas, that is Islam and Secularism. And today, inshallah, we will proceed with chapter 1, which he has titled The Contemporary Western Christian Background. So since this series is intended to go over the major themes of Islam and secularism, as opposed to what we are more accustomed to, which is to read line by line, I will inshallah try to summarize the chapter today by basically discussing two major components. One is the problem of secularization and the contemporary Western Christian situation, as summarized by Jacques Martin. And then secondly, we will go over the briefly what Professor Al-Attas has outlined as the problem of being in existence, in particular with reference to the existence of God within the Western Christian background. As we know, it is the custom of Muslim scholars that when they define certain things, or when they wish to speak about certain things, how a chapter or a concept is framed will focus on certain things and will exclude certain things. So when it is said here, the contemporary Western Christian background, yes, it means to refer to the West, as he would later define it in chapter 5. And the Western Christianity here would exclude, of course, to a certain extent, Eastern Christianity, and certainly the other religions such as Islam and other religions of the world. And why is this important? It's because, as we understand it, and as we will later come to understand, secularization, yes, has its roots in Western Christianity, yes, and not in, let us say, Eastern Christianity. There is a more recent book by Professor Remy Bragg. It is called Eccentric Culture, in which it is an essay written to highlight a major component or a major description of Western civilization, and eccentricity is understood here as a uniqueness. So according to Professor Remy Bragg, with regards to the West, he said that the essence of Western civilization is its Romanity, and by Romanity he means the process of inverse adoption, in which the Romans recognize their incompleteness, as it were, in terms of culture, that led them to borrow extensively, profusely from two existing civilizations. One is the Greek civilization, yes, for its philosophy, for its theories on education, and several other cultural practices, and then from the Judaic world. So therefore, Rome is where Athens and Jerusalem meets, yes, and but the Romanity doesn't cease there, because as we know, yes, the modern West is basically Europe, and Europe followed the model of Romanity and added more, yes, because they possess their own cultural traditions, being Europeans, from the Germanic tribes, from there being Icelandic and Nordic sagas and so on and so forth that were inherited by them. But they also, of course, borrowed from the Roman model in terms of Western Christianity and in terms of Western philosophy or Greek philosophy, but they added also to that the legacy of Islamic civilization. And this is where crucially the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine is different from Western Europe or Western Christianity, because whereas Western Europe incorporated a lot of the cultural tradition or the intellectual tradition of the Arabs and the Muslims, at least according to Remy Braque, the Eastern Roman Empire did not do so, but persisted within their own, let us say, models of what they have borrowed from the tradition of from their tradition of Christianity. So, nevertheless, now, when Professor Attas wrote Islamic Secularism in 1978, or when it was published in 1978, he mentioned that 10 years before that, yes, which is in the 1960s, the influential Christian philosopher and regarded by the Christians as among the foremost of this century, Jacques Martin, described how Christianity and the Western world were going through a grave crisis brought about by contemporary events arising out of the experience and understanding and interpretation of life in the urban civilization, as manifested in the trend of neo-modernist thought which emerged from among the Christians themselves and the intellectuals, philosophers, theologians, poets, novelists, writers, artists who represent Western culture and civilization. Who is Jacques Maritain? And why is he regarded amongst the Christians, at least up till the 60s or 70s, when gradually his prominence began to be replaced? Yes, he slowly began to be forgotten. Yes, but during that time, yes, he was amongst the few Christian intellectuals who tried to revive Thomism. Yes, him as well as Etienne Gilson, Joseph Marichal, which would be later mentioned by Professor Attas, and amongst the historians as Christopher Dawson. So Christopher Dawson and together with these other brilliant intellectuals tried to revive what they could of the Christian elements, or what they thought were the best of the Christian elements of Western civilization, to make it intellectually respectable. If we see the grand project of Jacques Maritain, he tried to revive Thomism by expanding epistemology and man's sources of knowledge. He described, for example, that there are sources of knowledge which is above empiricism and rationalism, and this is found in his book, The Degrees of Knowledge. Nevertheless, amongst his later books included this which is cited by Professor Attas, The Peasant of the Garonne, cited by Professor Attas in its original French. Yes, in The Peasant of the Garonne, Maritain basically complained and wrote a brilliant criticism of the contemporary Christian scene, as was seen in the result of the Vatican Council, as well as the Aggiornamento, which was called by the Pope back then, in which he sees that the effects of neo-modernist thought, the secular thinking, has begun to penetrate, yes, the thought structure of Christianity. Of course, what he was describing as being now entering into the citadel of thought, yes, with regards to how they understood the world in terms of secularization, has already been predicted by many other intellectuals amongst the within Western civilization ever since the 17th century. Yes, in the period which is called the Enlightenment, between the 17th and the 19th centuries, you see that in the university culture and in the culture amongst the intellectuals, which comprises, of course, the poets, the philosophers, the novelists, theologians, there is this trend of secularization. And of course, amongst them began to be seen and to be discerned a secular civilization that began to supplant a civilization deriving from Christianity. As we know, yes, the Western Europe had been held together which is called by the name Latin Christendom, by this medieval worldview deriving from Christianity, Islamic science, as well as Western philosophy in the guise of Aristotelianism, all together reflecting a theistic worldview. But gradually, the university cultures began to be slowly supplanted by a secular worldview that began to strengthen itself from the period of the Renaissance, what is called rebirth. And this Renaissance simply means or refers to the process of the rediscovery by modern Western men of their Greek and Roman sources. And they chose to follow the Greeks and the Romans and thought that the medieval period was what they called the Dark Ages. Yes, they wanted to return to their past in that sense. And this they press on forward until they reach the era of the Enlightenment, which has been described as the era in which natural science flourished, and the corollary of the flourishing of natural science meant the rise of empiricism and rationalism to the exclusion, yes, of the development of religious thought and religious metaphysics. So what Maritain was describing was through a penetrating perception how what was restricted initially to the intellectual classes has now penetrated into the very citadel of the Roman Catholic Church, and eventually through the rest of Western society, such that it began to be seen as if, at least during that period, towards the end of the first half and the beginning of the latter half of the 20th century, that society was undergoing secularization. Yes, a process in which they turn increasingly away from worlds beyond to the world here and now. Then, of course, Professor Attas continued his analysis by mentioning that some of the earlier thinkers of the 19th century had begun heralding a new era. Yes, they were speaking about a new era in which the world would be emancipated from religion. Yes, the likes of an Auguste Comte. So Comte, a sociologist and a philosopher, during his time predicted that there are laws of history and that there are different stages of its growth and development, such that, let us say, humanity in a mind influenced by evolutionism began with a magical worldview, and then from the magical worldview it advanced towards the mythical worldview. And so the magical worldview is a world whereby all the gaps are explained away by magical forces. Yes, meaning to say anything that cannot be explained can be explained by magic. Gradually, humanity began to improve itself, in which they impose their own human historical narration upon the universe, in which began the mythical age, the mythological age, whereby origins of the world stories and the stories of creation and the stories of the first men and women were colored by human history. So this is where mythologies came in. Yes, and eventually, of course, in the Comtean positivistic logic, after the magical period came the age of religions. Yes, somehow they say about 2,500 years ago, what they call the axial age, say 500 BC. Eventually, religion became replaced with, let us say, philosophy as metaphysics. And according to the Comtean logic, the highest stage of human development would be the empirical scientific age, in which their worldview basically rids itself away from any mythological, magical control, religious, metaphysical control of their reason, whereby they are now basically reaching the higher stages of their growth. And of course, whereas Comte established his philosophy of history using the positivistic logic, there were other philosophers who were more poetic in their expression. So the likes of Friedrich Nietzsche. Yes, and Friedrich Nietzsche, cited by Professor Attas here in several of his most well-known books, yes, like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, as well as his Genealogy of Morals and his Beyond Good and Evil. Of course, Ecce Homo and Birth of Tragedy is also mentioned here, but the previous three were especially important in outlining his vision of the world, of which it has already, according to them, been emancipated by theistic control, religious control of Yarism. So to dramatize the situation, Nietzsche called the era that they live in the era of the death of God. Yes, the era of the death of God. In other words, whereby Christianity or religious mythologies can no longer control them. And so in order to replace ethics and morality derived from, let us say, from the mythologies of Christianity, Nietzsche proposed a re-understanding, yes, of the genealogy or the origins of the morals, and basically he aims, at least, yes, to philosophize with a hammer, so to speak, to break, yes, the molds of mythological control and return it to the basic understanding of human desire for power. Yes, and since there is since humanity as individuals have a natural desire for power, they will hold to different strategies of arriving at power depending on their strength. So if they are a class of, let us say, creative geniuses with bodily strength and with various other gifts that have been planted in them, then they will prefer the morality of the strong, and otherwise they would have preferred the morality of the weak, and so on and so forth. So basically he is envisaging a new era in history in which the worldview of Western man would be secular, and it is not atheistic necessarily, because atheism as an attitude or as a philosophical position is defined against God, yes, against God, or in Greek times against the gods. So they are not atheists per se, but they are just secular. They are, according to them at least, the opposition between theism and atheism is no longer a meaningful category, because for them it is as if they are children who have now grown up to maturity and understanding that they cannot live, yes, by such myths, by such magical stories anymore. And finally, Professor Al-Attas also mentioned here Sigmund Freud, yes, Sigmund Freud, who borrowed extensively from Nietzsche, and earlier on from Benedict Spinoza, and several of these philosophers and psychologists predicted, yes, in his very scathing critique of Western theism, called Future of an Illusion, that belief in theism can be explained away by, let us say, man's psychological needs, by man's psychological development, and so on and so forth, without saying anything about the ontological status of the existence of God. Nevertheless, so with this general chorus, yes, amongst the philosophers, it was like this. Amongst the novelists and the playwrights and the other cultural avant-garde, it was like this. Yes, you began to see more and more individuals who were trying to develop a civilization by eschewing religion. Yes, early from 17th century, you have a Thomas Hobbes who tried to replace, let us say, the medieval tradition of political philosophy, which ultimately derives from Muslim, from the Islamic literature of mirror for princes, the Nasaih al-Muluk genre, unto a new politics, yes, a new politics which he called the Leviathan. Basically, politics now began to be understood as a mode of trying to manage power, yes, and trying to ensure certain goals were met, like survival of the Commonwealth and those within it. So politics began to be divorced from religion, and the tradition of political philosophy emerged from then, and they developed a cosmology, the Newtonian cosmology of mechanism or mechanicism, in which the world is understood to be within mechanical terms, as if it was self-sufficient. And in psychology, they began to do away with the idea of the soul, yes, with what they call the reductionist psychology. So, since the scientists and the philosophers and the novelists and the playwrights, including, of course, the artists and the composers, they began to give expression, yes, even an artistic expression of this worldview, this new worldview that they have in mind. Gradually, the theologians began to join and sing in the chorus, and this is what was worrying Maritain. Yes, Maritain was contemporaries with some of the Protestant theologians who tried to join in the chorus of secularization, because they saw that Christianity now no longer has the ability, no longer have the ability to curtail the development of this secular civilization. And with this raging contagion, they counseled instead that perhaps Christianity should be aligned with the forces of secularization. Yes, as they say, if you cannot beat them, you join them. And this, of course, due to their own historical realization that the last time when the church tried to intervene, tried to curtail the growth of this secular civilization that developed in the name of science. Yes, when the church intervened in the Copernican dispute, yes, between the church and Galileo, it was really, in truth, the church identified itself with the Aristotelian cosmology against this new cosmology, whereas it could have been better, but since that happened, yes, it led to several social and religious let us say effects, to the extent that it led to persecutions, and it led to the science versus religion debate, and several others that persists until this day, that allow some of the philosophers and the spokespersons for secularism to demand their rights to be treated equally, to be tolerated, and so on and so forth. So amongst them was, of course, Professor Attas mentioned several names like Paul Tillich, Chardin, Harvey Cox, who understood that the task of the modern church would be to align itself with the secularization as a philosophical program. And furthermore, Cox at least went as far as to say that the initial revelation, yes, the initial revelation was a movement towards secularization, yes, and that, of course, Maritain couldn't accept. Yes, certainly. That, of course, Maritain couldn't accept, because it would mean, it would be counterproductive to Christianity. So thus, when we see the Western background as presented by Professor Attas, he seems to be highlighting or summarizing what was predicted by the earlier 19th century theologians, as well as Cox, yes, who thought that eventually, with greater scientific acquaintance, with greater modernity, with the spread of urban civilization throughout the world, their prediction would have been that secularization and secularism would triumph, and that religion would be something of the nature of the past. Yes, but since Professor Attas had written Islam and Secularism, which has nothing, which doesn't take anything away from Professor Attas's penetrating perception of secularism, but for the Protestant theologians who align themselves with Cox, they have now seen that it has been falsified. Yes, their prediction that greater scientific and rational and understanding of the world, and greater urban, greater expansion of urban civilization would lead to secularization, has been falsified. Not only, theoretically, it is not something that can be decided, but as a matter of fact, yes, as a matter of fact, religion is in fact on the rise. Yes, and to such an extent that those who live to see their thesis being falsified, the likes of Harvey Cox, have had to now reverse their prediction, and some of them have now joined the other chorus, yes, of the return of religion, and others have heralded, yes, like Charles Taylor, as well as Habermas, yes, they have begun a new leaf, yes, by describing our era now as the post-secular era, because religion is not going away, yes. And in fact, yes, with the developments of Islam and its spread in Europe, yes, they have now to grudgingly try to to conceive of a new political stratagem in which religion is here to stay, and how then are you to be able to live within a shared space, yes, in a post-secular society in which some will continue to hold on their convictions with religion. So now that's the background, yes. But at least as of the schools, yes, that were in a sense they were humiliated in that sense. I mean, those who was mentioned by Professor Al-Attas, for example, who got on too fast to the bandwagon of secularization. Some of them went as far as Adolf von Harnack. Adolf von Harnack, who tried to understand the origins of secularization, tried to pin it on Hellenism as the culprit. It was the conceiving, yes, of Christianity within Hellenic conceptual terms, because as we know, yes, the patristic fathers or the early fathers of Christianity, in order to spread and disseminate their religious teachings, conceive of an Eastern Judaic religion within Greek theological and philosophical terms. And because of the philosophical tradition of the Greeks, that made the possibility of several of the central i'tiqadat of early Western Christianity, including the conceiving of God as a supra-rational person, including the conception of the Trinity and several other aspects. So Adolf von Harnack saw, yes, in his magisterial thousands of pages study, that the way forward for Christianity is to de-Hellenize itself, remove itself of the Hellenic baggage. But of course, Professor Al-Attas has a right to ask, and we have a right to ask, if they de-Hellenize themselves, what do they have to return to? Yes. And others, while not going as far as Harnack, yes, that you need to de-Hellenize Christianity, at least concurred with him that the likes of one student of one amongst the neo-Thomists, who said that if you that it is true that it was Hellenism that led to the restriction of Christian thought to the playpen of philosophical inquiry and to the kindergarten of human thought. Yes, the restriction of Christian thought to the playpen of philosophical inquiry and the kindergarten of human thought. Yes, and this is something profound. Yes, because truly, where if we in comparison when we speak about Islamic theology, yes, Islamic theology considers wahi or revelation as an important component. Yes, as an important component, and those amongst the rationalists who adopted the tendency of preferring what is those who adopted in the debate between, or in the relationship between reason and revelation amongst the Mu'tazilis and the Falasifa, for example, who wanted to interpret allegorically all the verses that appear to be to conflict with reason. Well, they were not the ones who became the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Yes. In fact, this so-called debate between reason and revelation has been settled by the Muslims by establishing a relationship that mutually enlightens, in which Imam Al-Ghazali gives the analogy that revelation is like the sun, and reason is like your eyes. If you remove yourself away from the guidance of the sun, then you'll be blind. On the other hand, if you close your eyes, certainly you cannot see. Yes. So both, yes, one in assistance of the other. So nevertheless, this was how perhaps we can say in essence the development as of the time of Professor Al-Attas in the 60s and 70s. Finally, the theologians that was in fashion then they thought that's okay. So since they were going to de-Hellenize themselves, and others thought that they wanted to revive Neo-Thomism or Thomism, the third school amongst them, or those who wanted to de-Hellenize, their method of developing Christian thought, was to align Christian thought with what was current in the philosophical departments. So amongst the major thinkers of the 20th century back then was first and foremost Edmund Husserl, who initiated a movement called phenomenology. So they wanted to explain Christianity or develop Christianity using the hermeneutics of phenomenology. Others thought that the more profound thinker was Martin Heidegger, who was a sort of student or who succeeded Husserl, but developed existentialism in a brilliant fashion. So they thought perhaps that Heidegger was the way forward. And Heidegger certainly is very influential up till today. We have amongst the disciples of Heidegger from various various schools of life. I mean, Heidegger was the one who pointed, at least modern man, to the problem of being. And he not only influenced generations of philosophers, but also some of these philosophers became movie makers, the likes of Terence Malick. Terence Malick, you might have seen some of his movies. He wrote a translation of some of the works, at least one work of Heidegger from German into English, until eventually he decided that perhaps some of these philosophies is best shown in cinema. Then there was the Vienna Circle. So Husserl and Heidegger on the continent, and the Vienna Circle promoted. The Vienna Circle consisted of philosophers, scientists, and thinkers, mainly amongst them physicists, but also you had an Oxford philosopher by the name of Alfred Jules Ayer, who thought that philosophy advances by linguistic analysis. So linguistic analysis, existential philosophy, and phenomenology, these three different methodologies of trying to understand reality, was what the theologians put their bet on to develop their theology. But as we see now, all these three schools have now been bankrupt. So what do you do, isn't it? If you align yourself with these schools, then what is the way out? And that's the problem of ever-shifting hermeneutics. So there appears to be no way out. We can mention there's one more trend after this that some of the Christian philosophers aligned themselves with, and it shows some promising results. And this is the school of Christian analytic philosophy, and some of their brilliant exponents included Alvin Plantinga, who developed some very important writings in epistemology, and William Lane Craig, who tried to revive a version of the Kalam cosmological argument. So nevertheless, and Simon Blackburn and several others amongst the analytic philosophers. So that's our brief survey. How did they get there? How did they get to that contemporary problem? So this is Professor Al-Attas' brilliant storytelling. He begins by telling us what it is now, how it is now, and give us an overview of what's happening and the disconcerting trends of what's happening. Then he begins to highlight the origins of the story. So he begins in this chapter to discuss the problem of being and existence, how they got into the mess, which he has already alluded to now, because he mentions the Hellenization, isn't it? So he begins with the issue with the problem of being and existence initially in the Parmenidean era. Parmenides is amongst the earliest of the Greek philosophers. Him and Heraclitus represents, let us say, the bedrock of Western discussions of metaphysics, being and existence. You will see that Parmenides and Heraclitus would be cited in Aristotle, who was in his time a historian of philosophy as well as a philosopher. So you see that his books on metaphysics, for example, is as much a record of what was presented in the tradition. History to philosophy is akin to empirical observation in science. Yes, history to philosophy is akin to empirical observation in science. History is needed because brilliant ideas may take a lot of time, may take a long time to materialize, or brilliant ideas needs to be seen in its germinal forms before it can be understood properly. So that's why history is as indispensable to philosophers as empirical observation is empirical observation is indispensable to scientists. So in Parmenides, he understood that being is necessary. Yes, being is necessary, and this is the commonsensical view. If you had no religious guidance, yes, if you only grow, yes, with your five senses and your psychological powers grow eventually, and assuming, of course, your fitrah had no means of being protected in its knowledge of God, and so on, then the world is seen as if it was permanent. Yes, being is seen as if it was permanent. So being as such is necessary. And then, of course, there was the commonsensical view would also understand that being and thought would be identical. Yes, what fills your thought, yes, is a record of what fills space. Yes, so being is that which fills space, and that which fills space is also that which fills your thought. This is the commonsensical view. And from the necessity of being, yes, the necessity of being comes also another let us say metaphysical conclusion. Yes, from the commonsensical view comes another metaphysical conclusion, that is that although being as such as a whole is necessary, but not individual beings, because obviously individual beings come into existence and exit out of existence. They suffer change, corruption, decay, and they come into birth. So therefore individual beings are contingent. And when they say contingent, that means that they are not necessarily existing, but they depend on something else as a cause of their existence. And this they can argue reasonably with regards to everything in the world. Nothing as an individual is necessary as such. But the being of species appears to be necessary. Yes, man and animals, yes, plants, and so on and so forth. So this is the Parmenidean being story. And then, of course, from this commonsensical view is also built a conception of truth. For a statement to be true is for it to correspond with the external world. Yes, that also follows, isn't it? Meaning to say that this let us say that streams seems to flow downwards and rain to flow downwards. Well, this statement is true if it corresponds with a fact external to me. Ripples, yes, rocks thrown into lakes will have ripples that flow that expand. Now that statement is true depending on what corresponds. Yes, so therefore we have this very nicely, neatly philosophical basis. So the likes of Plato and Aristotle, despite their wild speculation, could not challenge, nor could they dispute the necessity of being as such. Of course, they certainly developed and augmented and came up with various explanations to explain these various facets and aspects of being. But the necessity of being and its necessity in thought, this is preserved. This was not challenged. Then, of course, this basic philosophical substratum was now something that you had to negotiate with Christianity, which derives from some of the beliefs in Judaism, and they believe now in the existence of God, yes, who is the necessary being. So when they now try to negotiate between these two, obviously the world cannot be necessary because of what is found in Revelation, yes, because what is found in Genesis, for example, that God is the absolute creator of the world, and so on. So therefore, now they push the discussion into the second step, whereby God is the necessary being, and the world as a whole is contingent. Yes, so it's transferred from individuals being contingent to the whole world being contingent upon the existence of God. But whereas the the ontological status is now challenged. The epistemological status is not challenged, because what do they have? Yes, so being in the mind as such, now that's necessary. Yes, being in the mind as such is necessary, but it's world. Well, you can have it on faith that it was created. Now the third step. So from being necessary in mind, but not necessary as an external being, came the essence and existence division in Thomas Aquinas, which purportedly seems to be derived from Ibn Sina, but actually it is a confusion of the ideas of Ibn Sina, which we will deal in the next chapter. But the basic idea is that there is a difference between essence and existence with regards to particular beings. Essence is the answer to the question, what is it? The quiddity of something. So, since, at least in the Thomistic understanding of Ibn Sina, since you can know everything about a thing, yes, without necessarily knowing whether it exists, existence, therefore, is something else compared to essence. Yes. Of course, from this, some of the philosophers, the Anselm, for example, in the Middle Ages, he tried to develop what is called the Ontological Argument, which is a trick of the mind. But the idea is that essence and existence have now been distinguished. Yes, you can know everything about something in terms of its essence without knowing of its existence. They say the only exception to this is the being of God, because existence is His very essence. Meaning to say it is indistinguishable there. So they did this to save some phenomena, to save some aspect of their theology, but it will later come back to harm their metaphysics. From this, less than 100 years later came, so this position of trying to mix between the theology and metaphysics of Christianity and Aristotelianism was accomplished by Aquinas in his Thomistic synthesis. Then, less than 100 years later, William Ockham said, well, he said, if you can know everything about something in terms of its essence without knowing of its existence, that would mean there is nothing that you can add to know about something, whether it exists. And he gives a possible alternative, or he gives an alternative hypothesis. He said, well, what if, he said, your knowledge of the external world, yes, your knowledge of the external world is not derived from the independent existence of the external world. Let us say that your knowledge of the external world is the conclusion of your mind because of its own nature. Meaning to say, it is the nature of the mind that possesses a record of the world, but the world doesn't exist, one. Or two, it is God that created knowledge of the world in your mind without the world being existing. So therefore, since you cannot know of something in terms of its existence just by knowing its essence, the problem became inextricably bound, because there is one being whose essence cannot be known, that is God. But yet, since essence is His very essence, therefore God's existence cannot be known. Yes? So if His essence is not known, His existence cannot be known. They created their self-appointed problem of the existence of God. Yes? Of course, most of these men were men of God. I mean, they thought that this is just a matter of philosophical practice. Yes? Meaning to say, philosophically, they have now given up, because somebody like Aquinas worked so hard to develop this metaphysics, and then just 100 years later, Ockham had outdone this metaphysics. Of course, they say, well, metaphysically we cannot prove the existence of God. We'll just have to rely on faith and several other methods. Then, of course, the problem was at the level of a standstill, until eventually, as we know, came the era of the Renaissance, and then with that came skepticism, yes, brewed from Italy, yes, like it's coffee, yes, brewed from Italy, and then gradually it reaches the universities in Europe, until it came to the 16th century, where we began to see the skeptical essays of Michel Montaigne. But the most systematic new epistemology and new metaphysics was begun by René Descartes in the 17th century. So René Descartes then said, well, let's just put an end to scholasticism, yes, the medieval method of knowing. He began a new discipline of philosophy, which he bases on what is called empirical intuition. So empirical intuition, according to him, is the surest way of knowing something. An empirical intuition can grant me the existence of myself. Yes, because in his meditations on first philosophy, Descartes seems to show that however powerful a being, yes, to the extent that it can create my knowledge and my information, that being, if I can doubt my own existence, means that being cannot deceive me of my own existence. So therefore, this is the famous cogito statement. Yes, the cogito ergo sum. If there is thought, there is existence. I think, therefore I am. Yes, meaning to say, if there is thought, then there is existence. The thinking being must exist, let us say. So he begins with this statement. So, attempting to be the hero, yes, he claims that he can prove the existence of God a priori. Yes, a priori meaning to say bil badiha, without reference to the external world. Yes, he can prove the existence of God a priori. And he gave some two arguments which were quickly destroyed by many other philosophers, yes, to prove the existence of God. Because rationally, i.e. in terms of deduction, yes, until today, yes, no one has really proven that you can, via deduction, reach to the rational conclusion of the existence of God, conceived as such in that sense. You can, of course, use inference to the best explanation. Yes, you can, of course, and where deduction is concerned, you can conceive of a world whereby, if your premise is that if God exists, then everything else follows. It's possible, but it is also possible to begin your at least philosophically. It's possible to begin that if God doesn't exist, the world would still be. Yes. So in a sense, there is a room for submission. Yes, there is a room for real submission, whether or not you wish to submit to God. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't force you to believe in His existence, even though His existence is apparent, even though it is incredulous to deny His existence. But nevertheless, with Descartes, yes, they began to perceive that since rationally, at least within the development of Western intellectual tradition, you cannot prove the existence of God, they came to the final leg of this being an existence situation, to Immanuel Kant. And it was Immanuel Kant finally who basically claimed that metaphysical knowledge is beyond human knowledge. Metaphysical knowledge is beyond human knowledge. And this he does in a few steps. First, he said that previous to Kant, everyone had never challenged the Parmenidean theory. No one challenged the idea that the world is, therefore I have knowledge of the world. Yes, but Kant rather said, no, you haven't looked properly at your equipment. You haven't looked properly at your mental, intellectual equipment, your imagination. Rather, the world is depending on the type of equipment there is. Meaning to say, if you do a proper critical study of the internal powers of your intellect, the world basically that exists due to the phenomena that is caught by the intellect. As for the noumena, the reality of existence, you have no knowledge of that. You only have knowledge of reality as it presents itself to you. So therefore, the world as it is, as a metaphysical reality, that is something forever beyond human imagination, forever beyond human knowledge. And that settles it, at least for the West, that from then on, yes, they press on vigorously to the secularization. So since the 19th century, at least in the intellectual circles, yes, in the philosophical circles, they thought that they couldn't they couldn't prove the existence of God. So they developed science, philosophy, and the various other disciplines with the epistemology that there is no God, like that. And of course, Professor Al-Attas, as a conclusion to this chapter, mentions that the other problem also is that even if they were able to overcome such mountain load of obstacles, there is also the problem of the gradual development of Christianity that incorporated these different conceptions of God. Yes, the theos of the Greeks, the deus of the Latins, and then the God of the Germanic peoples. All of these conceptions are different, but they're forced into a conceptual amalgam. And now each and every one of them is being torn apart. Yes, and then there is the other problem that since they have agreed upon Trinity, so the Trinity, whatever the new conception will have to be shaped within the crucible of the Trinity. So therefore, this leads at least for Professor Al-Attas's brilliant analysis, within Western epistemology, there seems to be no way out. There seems to be no way out of secularization. Yes, and of course, although we said just now that the secularization thesis has been falsified as a matter of fact with regards to the growth of religion, we have to take this with a pinch of salt, because the sociologists who measure the rise of religion in our time, it is not necessary that the rise of religion means religion with knowledge. Yes, there are some who enter into the fold of some of the present denominations of religion as a matter of trying to get group membership, and others because it fulfills a certain void. Yes, there is, because if you define religion too vaguely, yes, to include, for example, nature worship, and then in other cases there is even what they call an anti-realist God, an anti-realist God by an anti-realist church. So the anti-realist God is believed by people who say that they know God doesn't exist, but they want to worship Him as if He exists. So if all of these are included within the phenomena of the rise of religion, so it is not a true falsification of that thesis. It merely showed, yes, of course, the falsification. What is falsified? What is falsified is their belief that science and technology will herald a new age in which people will be secular and in which people will be more intelligent. In truth, what has come into being is that, of course, it's falsified that that they will not be religious, because in truth they still possess the religious need. It is just that they've become even more superstitious. They become even more superstitious, and they've come to the next level of loss of intellect. Yes, and this, while at the same time the pulse of Islamization is still being developed, inshallah. So that's inshallah all we wish to share for today. And this we have already gone through. So the being in existence, as we said, began with Parmenides, and we've covered the Thomistic synthesis, and then we've discussed also Occam's criticism of the Thomistic position, until eventually we got to Descartes' empirical intuition, and then eventually Kant's attack on metaphysics. Inshallah. All right, until we meet again. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.